Hey, all right. So as I said, my name is Karl. I'm going to be talking about moving a large legacy code base over to Rails 5. So a little bit about me. I'm a software developer. I work at a company called Jobber, and we make software for small home service businesses. So that's people like landscapers, painters, plumbers, etc., businesses like that. I've been there for a little over 3 years. I've worn a few hats in my time. I'm currently doing like sort of SRE, sort of DevOps, sort of make sure the servers don't crash role. Yeah, and Jobber is primarily a Rails code base with a bit of JavaScript also. So it's, for better or worse, it's your classic Rails monolith. So what that looks like is, over 1,000 routes, almost 300 controllers, 700 some models. Not quite a million lines of code, but we're definitely up there. And as well as your usual tangle of gem dependencies that you get with any Rails app. And so I want to kind of ground a bit of what I'm going to talk about in the context of Jobber as kind of a development organization. So the kind of driving goal and kind of the foundational principle of the development team is early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And that principle drives most of like the decisions that the development team makes. And also the culture under which we work. And it manifests itself in a few ways. An obvious one is that we make it exceedingly easy for anyone to release code to production, and also as a consequence of that, easy to roll back a broken release if we need to. On any given day, there's usually at least 2 releases, sometimes 10, even 12 if it's a particularly busy day. And that can mean like dozens of pull requests going out, getting merged into master, getting shipped to production. And right now there's well over 100 pull requests against the master branch waiting to be reviewed and going out eventually. It also means that the development teams largely define success by releasing code that people will use. There's a little bit of nuance there, but largely, at the end of the day, what we want to do is get code that works into the hands of our customers so that they can use it and they can do their jobs better. And right now, and largely as long as Jobber has existed, designing, building, and releasing new features is where almost all of the development energy is spent. And that is a result of our goal to deliver early and continuous valuable software, but also because Jobber is a startup, and we're growing very aggressively. We've hired 80 new people in the past year. Not all of those are developers, but many of them were. And we're a growth-oriented company. We're a startup. We're trying to establish market share and become the dominant brand in our market. So a little bit about Rails 4 versus Rails 5. So Rails 5 beta came out in late 2015, I think like October. I don't remember exactly when. And then the 5.0 release came out June 30th, 2016. And then 5.1 was April 27th, 2017. 5.1 was ultimately what we wanted to get to in our upgrade process. Rails 5 was like a pretty big release. It changed a lot of stuff. It had a lot of great new features. But as a consequence of that, it took a lot of effort to upgrade. For instance, Shopify took 7 months. We're not quite at Shopify's scale, so it took us 4, but still a long time and a lot of effort. So the 3 like main Rails 5 features that you've probably heard about are the API only mode. Essentially what that is Rails basically without the view layer. So now, out of the box, you can use Rails as a backend if you're making a single page application with React or Vue or any number of front-end JavaScript frameworks. Or if you want to use it as an API for like a native mobile app or something like that. You could always do this with Rails, but pre-Rails 5, it just took a little bit of effort to do, but now, right out of the box, you can do it very easily. Also, the action cable framework to make it easy to work with WebSockets in Rails. Again, this was something you could do before Rails 5, but it just took a little bit more effort to do. And for people who don't know, WebSockets it's a protocol on the internet that basically allows for a connection between a client and a server to like constantly be open. So it's useful for real-time things such as a chat application, push notifications, things like that. As well, Rails 5 has better JavaScript support through supporting the Yarn package manager, out-of-the-box support for Webpack. You don't have to use jQuery anymore, which is very nice if you've ever used jQuery. But there's also many less exciting changes. And this is just another sampling of some of them, but these features get all the like press and get people excited, but if you're going to do an upgrade, this is really the stuff that you actually need to care about. So a few examples are like Ruby greater than version 2.2.2 is needed. Application record or active record now inherits from application record instead of active record base. Active job inherits from application job instead of active job base by default. Parameters and controllers are now not always hashes. They're sometimes objects. That tripped us up quite a lot, actually. And I've bolded this last one, and it's the protected attributes gem is no longer supported in Rails 5, so you have to implement strong parameters. And I'll dig into what strong parameters are in a little bit. But for instance, like if we take a look at the change log for Rails 5, like it's quite lengthy in the release notes. And so if you're gonna do an upgrade, like you basically have to care about almost all of these things. And I mean, it can be a lot depending on how big your code base is.
So strong params were there in Rails 4, right?
They were there in Rails 4. Again, I'll get into it, but
you had to implement them in Rails 5.
In Rails 4,
Yeah.
they gave you a gem to give you protected attributes.
Yeah.
But Rails 5, they fully
They
deleted
pulled it
them.
away. Okay.
So they were not really supported in Rails 4, but
Yeah,
it
that's
work around.
that one stuck out for me because I'm going. I don't seem to recall my params being up. I thought that was a Rails 4 thing.
Yeah, well, yeah, we'll get into strong params, but strong params was introduced in Rails 4, but they had a gem, so if you're on Rails 3 using protected attributes, you could keep using those on Rails 4. But if you want to use Rails 5, if you're going to Rails 5, yeah, you have to use strong parameters on Rails 5. So a rough overview of what the timeline looked like. As I said, Rails 5 was released mid-2016. Rails 5.1 released early 2017. When Rails 5 came out, there was some thoughts about upgrading. They weren't entirely serious. But basically, we just kind of never did it. We waited for a few reasons. And then I think sometime in 2017, support for Rails 4 came to an end as per the Rails release process, except for bad security patches. And it's never a great feeling to be on an unsupported version of the thing that your entire business depends on. So we decided we should probably get around to upgrading. And it took us about 4 months and close to 50% of our dev resources. It might even have been 60%. I don't remember exactly, but it was a lot of effort, and it was a big undertaking. So what we did was we were on 4.2. We wanted to go from 4.2 to 5, and then once we were stable on 5, go from 5.0 to 5.1. And so first, there was just a bit of like research done to get a sense of what would need to be done, how other people had done it, what lessons we could learn. But then after that, we just kind of arbitrarily divided work among some of the dev teams. And then as they were going about doing the upgrade work, we inevitably found other things that we didn't know about that had to be done. So then we just had a pool, kind of shared work that teams would pull from and contribute back to as they found more things that needed to be done. So as I said, Jobber, we release code all the time. And we have like hundreds of pull requests against our master branch. So we couldn't just make a branch, like do the upgrade work on that branch and then merge it back into master. Because while some of the dev team was working on the Rails 5 upgrade, there was other parts of the dev team that were still making new features and shipping those, so master was always changing. So it would have been an incredible headache to keep the Rails 5 branch up to date against master. So instead what we did is we created some tooling to allow dual booting. So you could boot Rails 4 or Rails 5. And that was just an environment variable where if it was true, you would boot Rails 5. If it was false, you would boot Rails 4. But basically what it meant is that any code that was written or changed for the upgrade also had to work in Rails 4 and be stable in production. So we merged and shipped as much of the upgrade code as we possibly could before we flipped the switch. And we leaned heavily on specs and a little bit of manual testing. So a lot of what the process looked like was you would read the docs, figure out this thing that had to change, go and make that change, and then you'd run the specs and you'd get weird spec failures, and you'd go read some more docs and figure out why those specs failed, and then realize, oh, I also have to do these other 3 things, so then contribute that back to the pool of shared work, and then either you or someone else on the team would do those things, and just kind of that was kind of the feedback loop where you'd make a change, run the specs, do some testing, just kind of see what broke, go read the docs, figure out what needed to be done. And then eventually we got to a state where we were pretty confident in the work we had done, but we got some people from the rest of the organization, so some people from marketing, success, sales, even some developers that weren't actively working on the project, and we had what we called a bug bash, which is basically we got them all in a room and set up a version of Jobber running on Rails 5 and said, try and break this for us, please. And then after that, eventually we just had to decide we're going to do it. We're going to go live with Rails 5 in production. We did it after hours, so there was less risk if it blew up. And we had people on call already if customers were calling us to handle that. It would have been nice if we had the infrastructure to move some of our traffic over to Rails 5 and then see what happened and have the rest of our traffic on Rails 4. That's what Shopify did, but we just simply, we don't have the infrastructure for that yet. It would be nice, maybe someday, but not today. And we drew heavily on what Shopify did for inspiration. So if you're looking to do a Rails 5 upgrade, I would recommend seeking out. Shopify has a great blog post about how they did it. And there's a lot of great steps in there, and we followed a lot of them. So here's just a sample of a few things that happened when we were doing it. And again, this is just a few things of the like tens of hundreds that we had to work on. So action mailer in Rails 4, there was an underscore path helper function. Rails 5, that function didn't exist. You have to use underscore URL. We didn't know about that, so some of our emails didn't work. We have an integration with QBO, which is QuickBooks Online by Intuit. And it broke briefly because the params object was an object, not a hash. We thought you could keep using it as a hash, and you couldn't, so it broke. Some of our sidekick jobs stopped working because the parameters unexpectedly were JSON strings instead of a hash. And as well, at one point, there was a model column, which we thought would serialize as a hash, but it didn't do that in Rails 5, so that broke a file upload feature. And again, I mean, this is largely what the upgrade looked like, was finding and fixing things like this. Not necessarily the most glamorous or like interesting work per se, but it needed to be done. So I'm going to dedicate a little bit of time talking about strong params, because it was probably the most like labor-intensive piece of work that we had to do. It's not necessarily hard, but depending on the state of your Rails project, if it was Rails 3 and then got upgraded to Rails 4, you probably will have to deal with strong params. So about 7 years ago, a clever person by the name of Igor Holmakov granted themselves commit access to the Rails project on GitHub. And they did this by exploiting a security flaw in Rails, which is called mass assignment. And so what mass assignment is if you're making a Rails model, you can basically pass like a hash which like represents the object that you want to make, and then just call user.new, call like object.new or object.create on it. So in this example, like we're creating a user, and we're just going user.new and passing this params at user object. And this allows you to create a model and like assign a lot of attributes to it quickly. The alternative would be like instantiating a new model and then one by one assigning the attributes, so going like user.name equals params at name, user.email equals params at user, or params at email. But what it allowed for was you could do an attack where, so if you could create a request which would look something like this. And so what this would do is it would create a new user with the name bad guy, and then you're passing this admin equals true param. And with naive mass assignment, you would just pass both of those attributes on to the user model, and then you would get a user created which had the administrator permission. And so then all of a sudden you've got an unexpected administrator in your system, and whoever created that can then use that user to wreak havoc on your system. So what was done to fix this was, in Rails 3, the notion of attribute whitelisting on the model layer. And so that's done with this @accessible method. So what this is saying basically is that you are allowed through mass assignment to set the name attribute and the email attribute of this model. So then if you tried to set the admin attribute at the same time that you're setting all the other attributes, that would be rejected and it wouldn't be allowed to happen. So that closes that security flaw. And that, I mean, it works fine, and it protects you against the exploit, but there was some talk in the Rails community if this was necessarily architecturally the best solution. kind of the argument being that in the Rails view of the world, it's the controller that is supposed to pass data on from the view to the model. So maybe it should be the controller that filters out what's get passed through rather than the model deciding what it will allow to come through. So in Rails 4, they introduced what's called strong parameters for mass assignment protection. And so what that looks like is that in your controller, basically you would permit on the params what attributes you want to allow to be passed through. So like in this example, now you're going user.create and you call this user params function, and then that just permits the name and the email to be passed through. But they allowed the old model whitelisting to still be supported via the protected attributes gem. So if you were a Rails 3 app and you're using protected attributes, and you upgrade to Rails 4, you could just keep doing what you were doing before, and everything would still work. And that's what Jobber did. So when upgraded from Rails 3 to Rails 4, uses protected attributes gem, and we kept all over the place all our models using this attribute accessible function. But now with Rails 5, they're deprecating the protected attributes gem. It's not going to be supported at all. So you can't use that attribute accessible method anymore. So you have to implement strong params. So we had to migrate all our controllers to use strong parameters and migrate all our models away from using protected attributes. And basically what we did is we created a module which we would include in our controllers. And through a little bit of meta programming, you could allow any controller to basically create an arbitrary permitted attributes method. So it basically looks like this now. So now most of our controllers have something similar to this, and where you just call permitted attributes method and then basically pass a method down to that, which will then define what parameters you allow to be passed through to models. But even after we did that, we still had to go through and get rid of all protected attributes from our models and make sure all our controllers were using strong parameters properly, and we had to test all that. So it's not necessarily hard in a technical sense. It just kind of, it was a lot of effort. You really had to make sure that you were doing everything properly, because if you weren't, then it would just straight up break in production, which would be no good. So what did we learn through this process? Waiting as long as we did to do the upgrade, maybe that was the right thing to do, but maybe not. There's pros and cons to that decision. The pros would be, by the time we got around to the upgrade, we had more resources in the organization. As well, there was more knowledge in the community about how to do a Rails 5 upgrade, what you have to watch out for, what you can do to make it easier. But more compellingly is the fact that by waiting, we allowed ourselves to keep making new features, keep being competitive in the marketplace, keep growing our market share. Because fundamentally, Jobber is a startup, and we're focused on growth. So there's an opportunity cost when you have to stop making new features to do this upgrade. And if we had paid that opportunity cost in say 2017, it may have eroded some of our competitiveness in the marketplace. But again, maybe it wouldn't have, and maybe if we had done it earlier when the code base was less complex, when we had less gems, less features to test, maybe it would have gone quicker. It's somewhat impossible to know, really. Upgrades kind of suck, especially if you do them in a big bang fashion. And by that I mean you just stop everything that you're doing before, do the upgrade, and that's all you do for a long period of time. And it was pretty demoralizing to the organization. And that's because, again, we like largely define success by releasing code that people will find useful and people will use, and doing a Rails upgrade. I mean, we all knew it was important and needed to be done, but it was just not necessarily the work that we wanted to be doing, per se. Like, we wanted to be making new features and giving them to people and hearing from them if they're using them, how we can make it better. So if you're going to do an upgrade and you're planning ahead for it, use deprecation warnings and announcements to make it easier to do. So for instance, strong parameters existed in Rails 4, and Jobber was in Rails 4 for a while. And when Rails 5 came out, they announced that protected attributes was not going to be supported in there. So at that point, we could have said at that point, okay, we're going to stop using this old way, start using the new way on new code from this point forward. And we still would have had to pay the cost of upgrading the old code, but it would have been less. So we could have stopped digging the hole if we wanted. Because it wasn't a surprise that we had to implement strong params. We knew it years in advance that we were going to have to do it. Automated testing is essential. It would have been impossible to do this without it. Get the rest of the organization involved. So this was a big project, and as I've said, it meant that like we weren't building new features, so that meant there wasn't stuff for the marketing team to market, there wasn't stuff for the sales team to sell. So it was important to kind of get them involved in the process in some way so that they like understood why we were doing it and why it was important, and so they could feel kind of a sense of connection to the work. Tooling for easily switching between Rails versions was extremely valuable. Again, dual booting was really the only way that we would have been able to do this successfully. So if you're going to do it, make sure you can boot Rails 4 and Rails 5 and test things on both. And lastly, fail noisily and roll back easily. So that just means like if you ship code and it goes boom, which happened a few times in the upgrade process, make sure you know about it quickly and that you can get back to a stable version quickly as well. Because otherwise your customers will suffer, and then your organization will also suffer because of that. Yeah, so that's all I've got. We have time for some questions, I think.
When it's time to move to Rails 6, are you going to do it the same way again?
Hopefully not. I mean, we're definitely going to like pay more attention to deprecation warnings, and like if there's some Rails 5 feature which we depend on, which we know is not going to be supported in Rails 6, and they announce like a migration path between the two, like we'll definitely say, okay, like on new code, stop using the old way, like stop digging that hole deeper. But yeah, as for when we'll upgrade to Rails 6, I mean, again, we don't know. We'll have to see when it comes out. And
I guess if Shopify does it first, then you can do your
yeah.
To what degree, if at all, was the team able to lean on scripting to help identify and refactor existing similar code books?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, it somewhat depends. So like not at Jobber, not everybody uses the same development environment, so we all use different tools. But I mean, like we use some tools to like find like which models we would definitely have to migrate away from using protected attributes. And then we just kind of like, once we had basically like a sort of which models we would have to upgrade. And then we use that to just like, we just kind of like arbitrarily divided them. Maybe like this team is responsible for these models, this team is responsible for those models. Yeah, but I mean, we didn't use a ton of scripting. Largely, it was just like reading documentation. Yeah. There's no real like secret sauce to doing this. It's just like read the documentation, make a change, read the documentation, make a change.
Was there a big push to get code coverage up before you did this?
You mean like test coverage? No, not really. I mean, our test coverage is already pretty good. We just wanted to maintain it. Yeah.
So how big is Ruby on Rails application in terms of popularity?
It's quite popular. I don't know exactly like where it ranks. There's rankings of like frameworks out there.
So
I don't know where Rails ranks per se, but it's very popular.
my
Yeah.
next question is then, so the Ruby and the Rails,
Mhm.
when they upgrade, like when they have a new version, both of them communicate, right? The Ruby and the Rails.
No, Ruby, they're separate.
Yeah.
But I mean, but the Rails team will follow what's happening with the Ruby team.
Okay. So if that's the case, then how come that there are so many problems? Why don't they consider all of these issues prior to their release?
They do. They do.
Uh,
They discuss
Yeah.
all of those things, or they go in great depth. So when you read the release notes.
But they don't consult everyone that's using Ruby on Rails.
No,
So
no,
in,
no,
and
no.
in this case,
Yeah.
like Karl mentioned, Java realized that, hey, this is something that's going away, and instead of saying we should make a change now, they just kept digging a hole.
Yeah.
So, and I suspect Shopify did a similar thing,
Yeah.
because I know for a while the expectation was this protected attribute scan would continue on past Rails 4, and they decided not to do that. So a lot of companies were definitely kind of like,
Yeah, that was the thing that confused me because
Yeah.
for me that change was
Was
the
Rails
3.4,
yeah.
right? Because I was going, I've just recently did on small apps of my own
Yeah.
and stuff like that, and I was going, I don't remember the strong params. I thought that was, but you see that was
Yeah.
that's the technical debt decision, right?
It is.
That you and so you that's a conscious decision that you're making.
Okay.
That you're looking for something that this is what I'm going to need to do. But when the Rails team decides, they're not, driven by one small group of people working at Basecamp, but some people would say that they are.
I mean, there's controversy with Ruby.
But that will drive a lot of what Rails looks like as you go forward with other people contributing to it as well.
Were you on the latest Rails 4 version before the switch over to 5 started happening?
No, we had to go from 4.2 point something to 4.2 point something, but I don't remember exactly what.
Did you go to the latest 4 version?
Yeah, whatever the latest 4 version, we were one or more versions behind on 4, and we had to do a 4 upgrade first.
It's almost
But-
required just because that's where you get all the deprecation.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I always do is go to the last version, the one that you're on.
Because if you could, it would have. Sorry, when I say you, of course I mean Jobber.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not trying to not be volume with Jobber, but
He is.
maybe you are. I don't want to put you in that place, but there's no way to make it more of an incremental upgrade. It's once you have your deprecation warnings done, the only thing left from there is to make the jump and then see what breaks, right?
I mean, yeah, largely, that's what you have to do is just get it so you can boot up a Rails server and start using it and see what happens. I mean, you can if you read the docs, you can be like, oh, I'll have to do this, I'll have to do this, I'll have to do this, but largely you just kind of have to get a branch, do an upgrade, and just kind of use things that happen to guide it. At least that was our experience. Yeah.
You didn't talk about gem upgrades and gem dependencies, and in my experience, my difficulty has mainly always been in resolving the gem dependencies.
Mm-hmm.
Or was it just too painful?
No, I mean that was. Yeah, I don't remember how many gem upgrades we had to do. It was a lot.
So I do recall, because, so a bit of background, I used to work at Java and I was there when they started. gem dependencies, there was a lot, but it wasn't definitely the big problem. It's going to be the strong.
Yeah.
That was going to be the biggest
Okay,
issue.
okay.
And despite the fact that Java had a massive amount of gems included, most of them we kept up to date. Or within.
So you were continually updating the
Yeah.
gems as
Yeah, yeah,
as you go. Okay,
yeah,
so
w-
that makes sense.
Or
then, yeah.
failing that, most of them were at a most recent enough version that they didn't have a requirement of Rails 4 versus Rails 5. They just required something.
yeah, we generally don't, we try not to let our gems get too out of date. And again, because we waited so long to do it, actually all the gems we cared about had Rails 5 support already. So we didn't have to upgrade gems and like make upstream pull requests. Like some companies did have to do that.
Most of the gems that needed to be upgraded were because we were locked to a version that
Yeah.
supported Rails 4.
Yeah. See, that's the one that I found is that,
Yeah.
that you get into these interdependency things where you have to rejiggle. And I don't use a lot of gems for things, right? So
So yeah, speaking from experience, most gems did not lock themselves to a particular Rails version. Some will have a requirement it must be greater than this,
yeah.
but most are not locked to a specific Rails version. Usually it's the Ruby version that's going to get in trouble with that.
Do you update the Ruby version relatively like with that as well, or was that?
Yeah, we don't have like a defined process for keeping Ruby up to date, but yeah, I mean we try to. We're on Heroku. That's where our production code lives, and so Heroku has to support a Ruby version before we can use it. So we can't necessarily always just be on the latest Ruby.
So for instance, in your work plan, you don't have a yearly task that we're going to upgrade Ruby or something like that, just to remain somewhat, even if it's not the most current version to, or like biannually or something like that.
You're probably going directly off what they tell you in the build process that we support Ruby 2.5, 2.5 or something.
Yeah, so like we're tied to what Heroku's build packs support, and we don't necessarily have an official policy. We just like
Okay.
we kind of try and keep up to date as best we can.
Again, I imagine it's changed a bit, but when I was there, it was if someone wanted to be on the newest Ruby version, they'd take the lead on that.
Yeah.
And as long as all of our gems were supported with the new version, there was usually an almost effortless upgrade. Ruby upgrades were easy, the Rails upgrades were difficult.
Yeah, Ruby upgrades are like pretty trivial usually. Yep.
When you started the project,
Pardon me?
when you started the project to upgrade, did you find a timeline? At the end, the timeline was the same, or did you have to add more time to complete?
It took a bit longer than we thought. Not overly longer. Like we knew it was going to be a lot of effort.
Would you need to add more resources or more developers at a certain point?
No, I don't think we added new developers. I think largely, well, it was somewhat of a staggered process. Like teams finished what they were working on before and then started working on the Rails upgrade, and like they didn't all start at the same time. But it was kind of known that like we would need a lot of resources to do this. Yeah.
So a question oriented more towards the newbies in the crowd. What is a deprecation warning, and what does it look like, and why would I ignore it, or why would I heed it?
So a deprecation warning, it's just it's a message to you as a developer that either this, for instance, a function that you're using from a library on version 1 is not going to exist in version 2. So when you upgrade from version 1 to version 2, you'll have to use a different function from that library. And developers usually ignore them because we're lazy and don't want to upgrade our libraries.
So they'll appear in your tests more often than not, because that's what you're running most of the time.
Yeah.
And sometimes
If you have
what
tests.
happens is they appear at the top, and if you have a lot of tests, they disappear, right?
Yeah, that's not, yeah.
And they're also not in code that you're working on, right?
It depends on the library. Some of
Yeah. And I mean, and it like not all deprecation warnings matter is another thing.
I might argue with that.
Some like, I mean, there's some nuance, but
There are some you can choose to ignore, but I'm not sure.
but yeah, like you want to pay attention to a deprecation warning because basically it's telling you your code is going to break eventually if you don't do something about it.
Yeah, but it's different if you're working in a team of 20 individuals.
Yeah.
You don't randomly go about changing somebody else's code, right? Or, you know, I mean, if you're tasked with delivering a specific piece of functionality, you might say, hey, we got a deprecation warning here that we're going to look at. But, you know, that goes into the job queue. That's, you know.
Yep.
This might still be a bit of a sore spot, but was there any code that you didn't find broke until after customers were already using it?
Yeah, there was. We upgraded from 4 to 5, and that was fine, and we were stable on that. And then we went from 5 to 5.1, and we have a time tracking feature. So users can like record the time they're using on their jobs, and we also have a report for that that can be sent to like managers on the customers that we have. And that report broke on 5.1, and so we actually had to go back to 5.0 and fix it, and then go 5.1 again. So we needed 2 tries at 5.1. But
Was that a test coverage issue?
yeah,
Okay.
pretty much, yeah.
I don't know how the servers and job would work, but was there an option or a consideration of do we want to roll this out to a small subset of customers? Like if you find that you have almost no market penetration in New Zealand, you just roll out the new version to New Zealand first and find out if there's any errors there.
We don't really have the infrastructure to do that right now. Yeah, someday we would like to have that, but we don't. That's what Shopify did. Was they put like 5% of their traffic or whatever on Rails 5, and then kept the rest on Rails 4, and then just like kind of moved that over. And then once 100% was on Rails 5, they were done their upgrade. Yeah, I know some companies are supposedly running like the master Rails branch in parallel and putting like some small amount of their traffic onto it. Again, that would be nice if we could do that, but we just don't have the resources.
Sometimes you have to architect it differently.
I'm just wondering, I probably missed the point. So for Real 5
Yep.
and Real 4, did you guys have the same database?
Yeah, yeah.
So was part of the real application, right? So was it MySQL or which one?
We use Postgres.
Oh,
Yeah, we didn't. I don't think we had to do anything like with Postgres itself. We had to change some things in the Rails model there, but we didn't have to do anything with Postgres itself. Yeah.
Did you guys notice any improvements in the speed or responsive application?
Like performance of our application. No, I don't think so. Our performance bottlenecks are not in Rails. They're all in the database layer.